In early 2020, I purchased this, a baseline off-the-shelf Intel MacBook Pro with the intention of using it as my travel workstation on some on-the-road video productions throughout the year. The reason I went with the baseline model is because I only needed it to do one main thing: allow me to dump and organize files on the go. The idea was that most of the editing and heavy lifting would still be done on my trusty 5K iMac. Now we all know how 2020 panned out, and needless to say, my MacBook Pro barely left the shelf for a good 4 months. However, throughout the latter part of 2020, when things started picking back up again, I found myself going back and forth between Metro Manila and Laguna during our transition to moving here, and having my MacBook Pro became a lot more important. Furthermore, I started a 4-month-long work project that had me using the MacBook Pro a lot more frequently. On the side of just having a laptop to use when in Laguna while my iMac was back in Manila, it did okay. Tasks like watching videos, writing scripts, attending Zoom meetings were totally within its capabilities, and it did just fine. But whenever I had to edit videos, use Photoshop, or manage files within Lightroom, things that the 5K iMac handled with ease, the baseline Intel MacBook Pro struggled a lot. Work became a chore, and I found myself waiting for Photoshop to respond to simple layer movements, and Final Cut Pro stuttered whenever editing 4K timelines. This created a bit of a barrier between me and getting work done, which was definitely not a pleasant experience. With that long-winded intro out of the way, I was extremely excited when Apple launched its new silicon with the introduction of the M1 MacBook Pro. I remember watching the release, and the first thing that came to my mind was game changer. For those who don't know, the M1 processor really shifts the landscape of Apple's computer lineup because for the first time ever, they're now using in-house M1 chips rather than outsourcing their processors from Intel. This brings a ton of benefits, but here are a few of the main ones, to name a few. Most of us are probably familiar with the smooth user experience of iPhones, iPads, and Apple Watches. And that's because Apple is able to design software to match their hardware to work together efficiently. This is not to say that their computers weren't efficient before, but rather, now they can be so much more efficient even with a lot less hardware. Ideally, this makes even their baseline products a lot more effective tools to get work done. Gone are the days where Apple had to wait for Intel to launch their processors before developing new laptops. Research and development takes time, and this would usually cause a lag between the latest processors and the latest laptops, which sometimes would result in new laptops not having the latest chips. With Apple now using and manufacturing their own chips, they can release new products whenever they want, and you know it'll be the best for the foreseeable future. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get to the laptop itself. This is my M1 MacBook Pro. It's the 13-inch variant with a baseline of 256GB of storage, but with an upgraded 16GB of unified memory. This setup will run you about $1,500 or around 84,000 pesos here in the Philippines. I opted for baseline storage because I do all of my storage-intensive work on external SSDs, and I don't keep much on my computers apart from temporary downloads and administrative files. Oh, and screenshots. Lots and lots of screenshots. I went for the $200 upgrade of 16GB of RAM because I read of swap issues, which we'll tackle later on in this video. Oh, and also because I was totally scarred from my experience with the baseline Intel MacBook Pro with only 8GB of RAM, so there's that. Today's video won't necessarily be a side-by-side comparison between computers because, well, frankly, I don't have the patience to do that kind of stuff, and there are a lot of other resources who do that kind of stuff a lot better. I'll link some resources in the description below, but one of my go-to channels is Mac's Tech. In this video, what I want to tackle is my experience with the M1 Mac as both a casual user and as a professional. Over the past 3 months I've had this Mac, I've put it to work in many different scenarios, including photo editing, video editing, some casual gaming, content creation, and overall general use. My North Star of success for the M1 MacBook Pro is that if it works even 90% as well as my 5K iMac, then I would deem it as an incredible laptop for its price. For reference, my Intel MacBook Pro ran around 60% as well as my iMac. Not to spoil anything, but since moving to Laguna, the M1 Mac has been my go-to workhorse computer, and honestly, I haven't missed my 5K iMac at all. Let's start with the area that you guys are probably most concerned with: photo editing. My editing workflow hasn't really changed a lot over the years, with my main staples being Adobe Lightroom and Adobe Photoshop. The one thing I'd like you guys to keep in mind is that Lightroom does not run natively on M1 Macs. Whoa, scary, right? Whenever I think of something not running natively, my immediate reaction is that it would be sluggish. But that's what's great about Apple's Rosetta 2. What it does is that it translates Intel-based applications for the M1 processor, and it does so efficiently that you don't even notice. If you'd like to find out whether an app is Intel-based or Apple-based, go to your activity monitor and check the CPU tab. Under the column Architecture, it'll say whether it's Intel or Apple. I've got to say, editing photos on the M1 Mac is great. Lightroom runs smoothly, and making adjustments with the sliders is responsive. There's no lag or stuttering when making even the most drastic changes, and it deals with spot correction like a champ. Batch exports are also a breeze for the M1 Mac. It had no problems at all. When editing, I also like to open Photoshop in conjunction with Lightroom via the Open as Smart Object feature. This worked alright. It takes a second or two longer than on my iMac, but once it was running, it was able to open files on Lightroom a lot faster. Editing on Photoshop is also a much smoother experience in contrast with my Intel MacBook Pro. The Intel MacBook Pro stuttered a lot, and adjustments would take a couple seconds to take effect at times. The M1 Mac, while not as instantaneous as the 5K iMac, doesn't really have any major issues in terms of performance in Photoshop. Some of the heavier renderings like perspective warp takes a second before starting, but it's nothing that would make the experience totally unbearable. For me, as long as it doesn't take away from the enjoyment of the editing process, then it's fine. So in terms of photo editing performance, I'd rank the 5K iMac as a solid 10 out of 10, with the M1 MacBook Pro at a respectable 9 out of 10, and the Intel MacBook Pro at 4.5 out of 10 for scale. The 5K iMac does everything you ask of it in a snap. The M1 MacBook Pro follows along with your commands, and the Intel MacBook Pro tries to keep up as long as it can, but eventually caves into the immense pressure of creative work, which isn't too far from the everyday experience of creative professionals. Alright, let's move on to video editing. For those of you who have been following me for a while now, you'll know that I'm an avid user of Apple's premier editing software, Final Cut Pro. Final Cut Pro is Apple's native professional-grade, please don't attack me for this, editing software, so in theory it should work exceptionally well with the M1 chip. And it does. I've edited a handful of videos for both this channel and my other channel, link in the description, on the M1 Mac, and the experience has been 98% amazing. I'll get to the other 2% later, but first I want to talk about the good stuff. Editing multiple 4K clips on a 4K timeline, scrubbing through clips and rendering said clips at the same time, applying color grading and LUTs to 40-minute long clips, importing Rs upon Rs of clips, speed ramping and rendering out timelines, exporting long videos. Final Cut Pro works wonders on the M1 Mac. Scrubbing and rendering 4K videos isn't a challenge at all, and it doesn't even sweat doing any of that. That's another thing. It works through all these heavy processes and doesn't even need the fan at all. I almost feel kinda stupid wasting $500 on a fan. Just kidding, I paid an extra $500 so my laptop would have the word Pro on it. Editing videos on the M1 Mac is exactly what I hoped it would be. Exactly like my experience on the 5K iMac. For comparison, my 5K iMac is spec'd with 8GB of Vega graphics, 64GB of RAM, and has the i9 processor. It also costs $4,000 or around $200K here, so damn well better be good. But the M1 MacBook Pro, it costs less than half of that, but works 98% as well in the area that I value the most. So that's a huge win, and bang for buck in my book. Speaking of 98%, let's talk about the 2%. I can't really give the full 100% equal performance with a 5K iMac because of a few odd hiccups I experienced once or twice while editing. Some of these include some lag in cutting clips when the battery was low, and sometimes Final Cut Pro would just crash when I'd toggle a keyframe. These problems went away after plugging in the Mac or restarting Final Cut Pro, but I felt like I had to report these experiences because, well, I experienced them. Whether it's a bug on Final Cut Pro's part or the M1 Mac, either way, it was something that got in the way of editing, albeit briefly, that I think is worth mentioning. Does it make the M1 Mac something I wouldn't recommend for video editing anymore? Not at all. It's still 98% of a $4,000 experience for $1,500, so it'd be hard for me to say no to that. Another video editing software that I had to use with the M1 Mac is Insta360 Studio, which allowed me to render out action camera clips. Now, this software doesn't run natively on Apple architecture, so I didn't really have high expectations for it. Surprisingly enough, it worked really well whenever I threw hour-long video clips at it, and it made my face go from to... Alright, now let's move on to some casual gaming. Note that I intentionally put casual before gaming because I don't want the comment section to go aflame with PC Master Race people roasting me because I claim to be a gamer. I'm looking at you, Judge. And besides, if you actually want to game, bro, why are you trying to do it on a Mac? Okay, disclaimers aside, the only game that I really play is Counter-Strike Global Offensive on Steam, so my experience won't be representative of all games, so take it with a grain of salt. I used to play on my iMac, and running on the highest settings, it would be smooth, but for some reason I would crash when I got into water. I ran CSGO on my M1 Mac on the highest settings, and it worked really well actually. I didn't experience any lag or stuttering, and the water crash bug never happened either. In fact, Judge and I even won a couple games, so yeah, get good.
First game back! Let's go, Judge! Oh! Oh yeah! Dude, you carried that. You carried that. Ah!
But yeah, casual gaming on the M1 Mac, a surprising check. The only other video game that I play on my Mac, or ever really, is Zwift, which leads me into our next category, content creation. Little background for those who aren't cyclists. Zwift is basically an online interactive virtual cycling world that lets you connect your bike and smart trainer to the game and lets you race, train, and ride in a virtual world. The reason I bring it up is because I recently made a video for my other channel where I ride up a mountain on Zwift 3 times. For this video, I was running Zwift, screen recording, and watching Netflix at the same time. Honestly, I was so nervous that either the screen recording would mess up or Zwift would crash. I didn't really care about Netflix. But surprisingly, the M1 MacBook Pro took it like a champ. I had 0 issues throughout making that video, and everything ran as smooth as butter. Now that we've tackled all the specific use cases of the M1 Mac, I want to talk about my experience with it as a laptop. At first glance, the M1 MacBook Pro and the Intel MacBook Pro are pretty much identical. But upon closer inspection,
Jesus Christ,
the previous generation MacBook keyboard.
But hey, this is a good thing. I absolutely loved the keyboard on my 2014 15-inch MacBook Pro. It was clicky and the keys had a good amount of travel for a laptop keyboard, of course. By far, I think it was the happy medium between slimming down the laptop and having actual keys. When they took it out for the new generation of MacBook Pros in 2016 with the butterfly keyboard, it wasn't just the slimmer keys that made it a bad experience. It was the fact that they kept frickin' breaking year after year after year. And finally, with the M1 MacBook Pro, Apple was like, hey, yeah, that didn't really work out as we expected, so here's a new and improved keyboard that won't break down after 3 months of use. Innovation. Woo. It's the same freaking keyboard from 5 years ago. Apple, just take the L. Admit you were wrong and move on. Thank you. Rant over. Man, I never thought I'd get this worked up over a keyboard. Wait, I have another rant incoming, but let's use the reverse sandwich method and talk about a good thing, the battery. With the new M1 chip, the MacBook Pro becomes ultra efficient with power, and this leads to amazing battery life. Apple claims up to 20 hours of battery life on a charge, and honestly, that is a really bold claim. Now, I would love to go and test this 20-hour battery life out, but I'm just too anxious for that, and I love working on a desk, which means my laptop is almost always charging, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, by the way. So I haven't really had the chance to test out their claims. But on the occasions that I work out and take my laptop with me to our gym area, after a 3-hour workout session, the battery wouldn't even have a dent. And that's with full brightness on and keeping Chrome and other apps in the background. I also once tested the battery of the M1 MacBook Pro when I did a 3-hour editing session using Final Cut Pro and Lightroom at the same time while watching YouTube videos on an external monitor, and after those 4 hours, that was a long sentence, the battery life was at 75%. That's really impressive, honestly, considering the load I was putting on the laptop for extended periods of time. So if you're the type to use your laptop unplugged throughout the day, I'm pretty sure you'll be more than fine with the battery life of the M1 MacBook Pro. Okay, reverse sandwich method calls for a rant now. I talked about the keyboard, so let's move on a little north of that and talk about that slab of glass known as the touch bar. Pros from the previous generation MacBook Pro. We now have a dedicated escape key. It only took 5 years. No more apps hanging and no way to restart them because the damn escape key would hang as well. Alright, Gab, calm down. This is a good thing. Okay, the cons. The touch bar is still there. When I first saw the touch bar, I thought, oh, what a fun gimmick. But yeah, we'll get used to it and learn to love it. Nope, I hate it. Never use it unless I absolutely need to, aka when I need to change the volume or the screen brightness. It really doesn't help that those times are mostly when I'm on the smart trainer and pedaling as hard as I can, and I can't for the freaking life of me turn the music down with one key. It always has to be a 2-part thing where I tap the volume icon, then get back on the bike, then get out of the saddle to dial in my desired volume. And most of the time, because it's a slider rather than clicks, I go too far and end up with too high or too low. It's just not the best experience versus, a tactile button. But yeah, overall, I'm not a big fan of the touch bar, and I'm happy to hear rumors that Apple will be removing it in future generations of MacBooks to come. Okay, the next thing I want to tackle are the ports. The baseline MacBook Pros have 2 Thunderbolt 3 USB-C ports on the left side. If you get the upgraded MacBook Pro, it can go up to 4 ports with 2 on each side. However, there is no option for this yet on the M1 MacBook Pro, so we're stuck with 2 ports on one side. Are 2 ports enough? For most casual users, probably, but because I use my Mac mostly with an external monitor, there's some cases where I find myself looking for another port. One port is dedicated to running my external monitor via a Moshi 4K60 dongle. It's important that it be directly connected or it won't run 60Hz, which is a must. If you've tried anything less than 60Hz, you'll know what I mean. The other port is dedicated to running a USB-C hub, which connects to power and other peripherals. Now here's the catch. Because I edit off an SSD, I really prefer not running that SSD through a dongle for fear of random ejections, which have happened before. That could potentially corrupt files. So that means when doing any editing work, be it photo or video, I have to unplug the power to connect my SSD. Thankfully, as I've mentioned, the battery life of the M1 MacBook Pro is pretty good, so it makes up for that. But ideally, the solution would be more ports or a really expensive, fast, and reliable USB-C desktop hub, both of which would probably run me another $300. So yeah, expect a USB-C desktop hub review in the future, I guess. I said I would go into why I chose to upgrade my unified memory to 16GB, and that's because of swap. Now, I'm not really the best person to explain this exactly, so I'll link a resource in the description if you want to know. But for reference, with 16GB of RAM, my swap usually stays between 3 to 8GB. Overall, I really love the M1 MacBook Pro. It's fast, reliable, and works 90% as well as my desktop back in Manila. It does have some room for improvement in hardware areas like the touch bar and its ports, but overall, once you just accept those drawbacks, if you can call them that, then you'll have a great experience with it. It's an amazing mobile workstation, and for a first generation product, it really hits it out of the park. That being said, who would I recommend this to? If you're a creative professional in the video or photo sphere looking for a powerful desktop and mobile workstation, the M1 MacBook Pro is a great choice. I can't really speak for non-Apple video editing software like Premiere, but if you use Final Cut Pro, I would 10 out of 10 recommend this laptop. It also runs considerably well with Intel architecture apps like Lightroom, so that's really reassuring if you're worried about app compatibility and translation. Furthermore, with Photoshop now having a version that can run natively on Apple Silicon, this makes the future look bright for other apps in the Adobe suite. If you're the everyday person who just needs a laptop for tasks like browsing the web, watching videos, editing documents, and occasionally throwing together a family video on iMovie, I'd still recommend the M1 MacBook Pro, but it might be a little overkill. Instead, I'd point you in the direction of the M1 MacBook Air, which runs on the same processor, just sans the cooling fan, which never really turns on anyway. You'll be saving yourself $300, which you can put to buying a nice dongle, because that's the world we live in now. Now, if you're considering an M1 Mac but are worried about compatibility issues, I'll link a resource down below where you can check if the apps you use can run natively on M1 architecture or can be translated well by Rosetta 2. But from my experience, those aren't really issues or things you need to worry about, because just about every app I used from my Intel Macs run well on the M1 chip. And finally, if you still need that one last bit of convincing, I'll tell you what I told myself when I decided to pull the trigger on the M1 MacBook Pro. If this thing is even 90% as good as my 5K iMac, I'll be completely happy. I took my chances and they paid off. For less than half the price, it's more than 90% as good, which is great value. And that's what I really want to focus on. Value. This thing packs a punch and does most, if not all, the things I throw at it at a fraction of the price of my other computer. That's amazing. I'm thoroughly happy with this laptop, and I'm really excited for what Apple has in store in the coming years with their own silicon. Maybe even so happy that it's time for me to sell the 5K iMac and wait for the Apple Silicon iMac. The bigger one, of course. But yeah, that's a video for another day. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and drop a like if it helped you in any way. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the direction Apple is going with their own silicon. Have you tried it? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Let me know down below. Anyway, see you guys next time.